7 days. That is how long he had not slept. The abscess had started as a dull throb behind his back molar, the kind of pain a man tells himself he can work through. And for first 2 days he could. By day 4, his jaw had swollen to the point where closing his mouth fully was no longer possible. By day 6, the fever arrived, and with it a heat behind his eye socket on the affected side that felt less like pain and more like something pressing outward from inside his skull, looking for a way out. On the morning of day 7, he walked into the blacksmith shop, sat down on the wooden chair that had been pulled to the center of the room, and looked up at the man approaching him with a tool that had last been used to pull a nail from a horse's hoof. He opened his mouth. Welcome to the raw frontier. Today we are opening the mouth of the Old West. And what is inside, it is not the gleaming white smile that Hollywood spent decades plastering across the faces of its frontier heroes. You are going to discover what a dental abscess does to the human body when it is left to progress without intervention, why the only person available to stop it was a man who shod horses for a living, and how a cavity, the most ordinary and manageable of modern medical inconveniences, was one of the frontier's most reliable pathways to a slow and agonizing death. The smile in the Western film is perfect. It is always perfect. The hero's teeth are straight and white and intact in a way that communicates health and vitality, and the particular kind of physical authority that the genre requires its protagonist to project. He grins at the heroine. He grins at the villain before the draw. The camera loves his teeth because his teeth are the product of a dentist's office, a makeup department, and 50 years of orthodontic refinement that would have been entirely unrecognizable to any actual person living on the American frontier in the 1860s or 1870s. The mouths of the frontier were a different environment entirely. The diet that sustained a pioneer or a cowboy on the trail or a homesteader through the seasons was not designed with dental preservation as a consideration, because dental preservation was not a category that the frontier's urgent hierarchy of concerns had room to include. Hardtack was a trail staple, a biscuit made from flour and water and baked to a density that approached stone, intended to survive months in a pack without spoiling, which accomplished by becoming so thoroughly desiccated that biting into it without prior soaking was a structural challenge that the teeth approached at their own risk. Dried fruit, dense and sticky and saturated with concentrated sugars that adhere to the surfaces of teeth and remain there. Molasses, used to sweeten and preserve and flavor everything in the frontier kitchen, coating every surface it contacted with film of fermentable sugar that the bacteria already present in every human mouth approached with the enthusiasm of an organism that had just been handed everything it needed. The cleaning regimen available to manage these dietary inputs was limited in a way that modern understanding of dental hygiene finds difficult to fully appreciate. Salt, rubbed against the gum line with a finger, provided some abrasive function and some antibacterial effect. Charcoal was used similarly, with even less reliable benefit. The toothbrush, in any form approaching modern design, was not widely available or widely used on frontier. Flossing, in any systematic sense, was not practiced. The residue of every meal remained in contact with the tooth surfaces and the gum line until the mouth's own saliva and whatever rough physical action the day provided managed to dislodge some portion of it. The bacteria that caused dental decay did not require particular conditions to thrive in this environment. They required only the sugars the diet reliably provided, and they were patient in the way that biology is patient, working continuously and without pause through the enamel surface and into the softer dent beneath, and finally through to the pulp chamber at the tooth's core, where the blood supply and the nerve endings lived. This progression was silent in its early stages. A mild sensitivity, a vague awareness of something changed in a particular tooth, the kind of discomfort a working person in a demanding environment notes and sets aside because the demands of the day are more immediate and more addressable than a tooth. By the time the pain announced itself as something that could not be set aside, the infection had typically reached the apex of the root, where the nerve exits the tooth and enters the jawbone, and had begun to accumulate there. The abscess forms at this location, a pocket of infection contained initially by the body's immune response, but building pressure as the bacteria continue their work within that enclosed space. The pressure has nowhere to go. It builds against the surrounding bone and soft tissue. The jaw swells. The swelling does not remain local. It rises along the facial planes, closing the eye on the affected side, distorting the profile of the face into something the person's family no longer entirely recognizes. The fever comes because the body has correctly identified a serious infection and is responding with the only systemic tool it has available. The pain by this stage is not the pain of a tooth. It is the pain of bone under pressure, of nerve tissue bathed in the inflammatory byproducts of an infection that has been given weeks to establish itself without opposition. The taste in the mouth of a person with an advanced dental abscess is a specific and constant presence. The pus draining from the abscess into the oral cavity carries a flavor that the body registers as deeply biologically wrong, a signal that has been wired into human threat detection at a level below conscious thought. It is there on waking, and it is there through the day, and it is there in the moments before sleep that the pain increasingly prevents from arriving. The fever produces a thirst that the swelling makes difficult to address because swallowing has become a deliberate and painful act requiring conscious management of the jaw and throat that swallowing is not supposed to require. A pioneer in this condition had been sleeping in broken intervals for days by the time the decision was made to seek intervention. The working body of someone who had been running a fever for a week while eating minimally and sleeping poorly was already compromised in a way that made the idea of sitting in a chair and having something done to the source of this suffering seem, despite everything it was certain to involve, like a form of relief. There were no dentists within practical distance of most frontier settlements. The profession existed, concentrated in the cities of the East, and a small number of trained dental practitioners did work the frontier circuit, moving between towns and setting up temporary practices before moving on. If you were in the right town on the right week, you might encounter one. Most people, in most places, on most weeks, were not that fortunate. The blacksmith was available every day. The logic of this choice was not irrational. The blacksmith possessed, by definition, the qualities most directly relevant to the task at hand. He had tools designed to grip metal objects embedded in resistant materials and apply sufficient force to extract them. He had hands accustomed to exerting that force with control, and without flinching, he had, through his daily work with large animals and hot metal and the general violence of his trade, a tolerance for the kinds of sounds and resistance that the procedure would produce. He was not a dentist. He was the closest available approximation to one, and approximation was the best the frontier offered. The tool most commonly used was a device called a turnkey, or in some accounts, simply referred to by the name of whatever equivalent was at hand. It was a lever mechanism with a rotating claw designed to grip the crown of a tooth and apply rotational and upward force simultaneously, in a trained operator's hands, working on a straightforward extraction under conditions that allowed for proper assessment of the tooth's root structure and the surrounding bone. It was a functional instrument in the blacksmith's hands, working by lamplight in a frontier shop on a jaw that had been compromised by a week of spreading infection and a fever that was making the patient's cooperation unreliable. It was something else. The men who held the patient down were not there as ceremony. They were structural to the procedure. A person undergoing tooth extraction without anesthetic does not remain still as an act of will. The body's response to the level of pain produced by the application of a metal instrument to a tooth in the context of an active abscess is involuntary and powerful and supersedes any conscious intention to cooperate with the process. For men meant 4 points of contact, restraining the shoulders and the arms and attempting to stabilize the head, which was the most critical and the most difficult element because the head must be both fixed in space and accessible to the instrument simultaneously. The whiskey administered before the procedure was not anesthetic. Alcohol does not block nerve transmission in the way that the compounds used in modern dental anesthesia block it. It produced some degree of systemic sedation, reduced the acuity of the patient's engagement with what was happening, blunted the edge of the experience without removing it. The patient felt everything. He felt it with the slightly softened edges that a quantity of frontier whiskey could provide, which is to say he felt it with the softened edges of the substance that, as his channel has previously established, contained compounds that were not doing his body any additional favors. The grip of the instrument on the tooth, the pressure of the metal claw seating itself around the crown, preceded the application of force by a moment that the patient experienced as the last moment before something irrevocable began. The force that followed was not surgical in its precision. It was mechanical in its application. The blacksmith working against the resistance of bone and infected tissue with the leverage of his tool and the full engagement of his upper body strength. attempting to work the tooth free from the socket that had been holding it in place for years. Bone breaks in this context with a sound that the people in the room carry with them afterward in a specific way. Not a crack in a way that a branch cracks, sharp and clearly located in space. A deeper, closer sound, felt as much as heard, originating inside the patient's own skull and transmitting through the bone structure of the jaw in a way that the patient experiences not as sound, but as something that does not have an adequate category. Jaws broke. The accounts of frontier extractions gone wrong record this with enough frequency to establish it as a complication that the procedure routinely risked rather than an exceptional outcome. The instrument applied to a tooth under the full force available to a man who worked metal for a living could transfer that force, when the tooth resisted, to the surrounding bone. The alternative failure mode was the tooth itself. An abscess at the root of a tooth for a week or more does not leave the tooth's structural integrity unaffected. The infection processes the surrounding tissue and can affect the tooth's own substance. And a tooth that has been compromised in this way does not necessarily behave as a single intact unit when gripped by a metal instrument and subjected to extraction force. It fractures. The crown separates from the root. The instrument comes away with a portion of what it was attempting to remove, and the infected root, the portion most urgently requiring removal, remains seated in the jaw, now additionally traumatized by the failed extraction attempt, the gum tissue torn and bleeding around the broken remnant. The infection that was already present in the surrounding bone now in direct communication with a fresh wound. The blacksmith looked at what was in his instrument and at what remained in the patient's mouth, and made a decision that the available options constrained to a narrow and unsatisfactory range. If the extraction succeeded, if the tooth came out intact and the socket was reasonably clear, the procedure was complete in the sense that nothing more could be done. The wound was rinsed with whatever was available, which might be water of variable quality, might be whiskey, might be nothing at all, and the patient was considered to have received the intervention that the frontier's resources permitted. He went home. He rested. He waited to find out whether what had just happened to him was the end of the ordeal or the beginning of a different one. The tools that entered the patient's mouth during this procedure had not been sterilized in any meaningful sense. Sterilization as a medical concept did not become standard practice in American medicine until after Lister's work on antiseptic technique began to be adopted in the 1870s and 1880s, and the adoption was slow and uneven in the medical mainstream, let alone in the improvised practice of frontier extraction. The turnkey or pliers used on the patient's tooth had been used before him, on whatever procedure before his had required, and had been wiped or not wiped and returned to the surface where it rested between uses. The residue of the horse's hoof, the metal stock, the previous patient's wound, remained present on the instrument's surfaces in quantities that the lamp's light did not make visible and that no one present had a framework for understanding as relevant. Into the open wound of a fresh extraction, into the raw socket and the traumatized surrounding tissue and the inflamed gum that had been pulled and torn during the procedure. This residue was introduced directly and thoroughly. The infection that followed was not a possibility that some patients experienced. It was a biological certainty that some patients survived. The wound itself was already a compromised environment, weakened by the underlying abscess and the week of systemic fever that had preceded the procedure. The introduction of additional pathogenic material through contaminated instruments into that environment, at a moment when the body's local defenses had been disrupted by the trauma of extraction, was not a scenario that the immune system of a frontier pioneer, already taxed by everything the frontier demanded of it, was reliably equipped to manage. The infection that descended from the jaw into the throat and the chest moved along tissue planes that connected the oral cavity to structures that the body cannot sustain damage to and continue functioning. The infection that traveled upward through the thin bone of the jaw and the spaces adjacent to the skull, toward the structures of the brain cavity, took a different route to the same conclusion. The pioneers who died of dental infections died in the delirium of high fever, the body no longer capable of organizing its responses to the cascade of sepsis, the brain receiving inadequate oxygen through a compromised circulation, the distance between the conscious person who had walked into the blacksmith shop a week earlier and the person now lying on the bed in the cabin becoming, over the course of days, an unbridgeable one. They had survived the extraction. They had endured the chair and the restraint and the sound and the aftermath. And then the instrument that was supposed to end the suffering had simply begun a different chapter of it. The frontier did not always announce its lethality. It did not always present as weather or animal or violence or water. Sometimes it presented as something that had been quietly building the back of the jaw for months, invisible and symptomless and patient, waiting for the sugar in the dried fruit and the molasses and the hardtack to complete the work it had started, a microscopic biological process, conducted without awareness, in the mouth of a person who had more urgent things to tend to, that ended with four men holding someone down in a blacksmith shop and a tool covered in things that should not enter a wound, entering a wound. The West did not need a bear or a gunfighter to take a man. It needed a cavity and sufficient time. So tell us, 7 days into that fever, the jaw swollen past the point of eating, the pain beyond anything a working definition of the word pain was built to contain. The blacksmith is available now. The chair is empty. Or you can go back to the cabin and wait, because the infection may drain on its own, and some of them did. Some did not. You have seen the tool. You have seen the chair. You know what four men in that room are there for. Will you choose? Leave it in the comments. And if the state of the frontier mouth has adequately disturbed your sense of what daily life in the Old West actually involved, consider what those same mouths were drinking at the end of each day. The whiskey being poured across the bars of every frontier saloon was not the product of careful aging and honest distillation, and what was instead is a story that the word toxic only begins to describe. Click on our video about the real chemistry of Wild West whiskey. What was in the bottle is waiting for you on the screen. Raw, visceral, history. This is the raw frontier.